Welcome to Sahitya Akademi's Webline Literature series. And today's program is in English language. Today we are going to discuss the role of translation in a multilingual society. This is the second episode of the translation series. And in the first series, we talked about many things. How translation is inevitable from the everyday life of the traders to literature to philosophy in legal form everywhere. In the translation is inevitable, especially when we have a country like India with 1,000-odd languages. And it's even within the particular region, there are so many dialects. For example, GST came and the people printed in Hindi and gave, but many people are not familiar with that. So it has to orally, it was translated to Avdi, Bhojpuri and all that stuff. So like that everywhere, in every region, every language it happens. So it's a part of life, not now, for maybe 2,000 years. We have had, everybody talks about Bible translation. And we have had adaptation, the process of adaptation much, much earlier than anybody else. Probably 1,500 years ago, we had Ramayana, Mahabharata adapted into various languages, Marathi, Telugu, Bangla, and all that stuff. So what is that? In addition to that, it's not only the words, it's not sound, it's not merely meaning, but culture. So one of the main questions that arises out of this translation among various languages is portability of culture. It is not merely some sound you're translating a particular piece of culture from one milieu to another milieu. Portability, whether it's possible, but we will go to that later. So we will start with initial thought. Neeta ji, you please go first.
Thank you so much for having me here, Rajmohan ji. It's an honor to be part of this discussion and to be in the company of such esteemed speakers like Professor Afsar and Krishna ji. So, I come to this discussion as a commercial publisher of translations. That's what I've been doing for over 20 years now. I'm a publisher at Yatra Books. And I'm a literary consultant with a very special emphasis on translations. And I also edit a literary journal. It's called Anuvad, published by the Bharatiya Anuvad Parishad. It's a quarterly journal, which is looking at the academic issues surrounding translations, especially between Indian languages, from and within Indian languages. And as far as Yatra Books is concerned, as the name suggests, we called it Yatra because of the journey, the translation, the literary journey that text makes from one language to another to empower Indian language readers and to connect a kind of a very multivocal bhasha writing into a powerful national voice. So we focus on quality translations into Hindi, English and other Indian languages, mainly for the internal markets. We've been publishing, over the last 15 years that Yatra Books has been active. We've published over 400 titles in English, Hindi, Marathi, Urdu, Telugu, Gujarati, Odia, Bangla. And some of these have been collaborations. There have been collaborations with international institutions as well. For instance, Sciences Po in Paris for the translation of Christophe Jaffrelot's book. It's his contemporary history of India called India Since 1950. We've collaborated with organizations like Ramon Llull Institute in Barcelona for Catalan short stories translated into Hindi again. Turkish Ministry of Culture for translations, which was a collaboration between the Bharatiya Anuvad Parishad and the Turkish Ministry to bring some beautiful novels from Turkish language to Hindi. And some of them have been published in collaboration also. So we have co-published with Penguin India, with Dorling Kindersley, with Cambridge University Press, and more recently with Westland and Amazon. Because, just to put it in perspective, at Yatra, our strengths are more the editorial strengths and the capacity to connect with translators across different languages in India. So connecting with a larger publishing house has given us the freedom of working with a very large scale publishing house while retaining an autonomy, which is what Yatra stands for, high quality, and keeping that independent voice alive. Now, one thing that I want to mention here, which is quite important, because when we look at translation projects, especially from the perspective of a publisher of commercial fiction or trade publisher, what we have to look at is that these translations are very expensive projects. And that's the reason we often look out for institutional support to take care of the translation costs. Because these are very high costs for a small publisher to pay. And it also limits the number of books that we can work on. So these international organizations and culture ministries in Europe, for instance, they support the translation of their literatures into Indian languages, because it's again for them a way of taking their cultural, taking their culture to different readers across the world. So in India, this is something that we've all often talked about, even at the Sahitya Akademi, that we need the Indian government organizations like the Sahitya Akademi to support the translation of Indian literatures into international languages, so that we can see the impact of Indian writing in languages internationally. So this has been one of the focus areas where we've been also trying to coordinate with, and at different conferences we've been talking about it. Because, for instance, what happens, and this is a very real life situation, where you see media houses, when they bring out lists of books written in India, they often only refer to books written in English. And the books that are written in the Indian language, they are hardly paid any attention, because quality translations are not available internationally for those journals like, say, Guardian or New York Times. They don't come to know about these works. So it's very important for us to put these the work that Krishna ji is doing and Afsar are doing. These are works that they're doing it out of a sense of love and a sense of, but how many people are how much of this literature is being translated and shown to the world. So, for instance, I'm just quoting the example of a country like South Korea, which has a very clear program to support indigenous translation of their indigenous writing. And they've already won a Man Booker International Award. So for me, it's very hard to believe that in a nation of 1 billion plus people, don't we have writers of that caliber? It's not possible. So we need to come together, all of us, people like you who are working in this field of translation, people like me who are working in that, the actual process of getting it done, people who can take decisions to support this kind of activity. We need to have more dialogue and find a way that wonderful literature, the novels, the wonderful writing in the Indian languages, not just the canonical works, not just the, the classical works, but what is being written, contemporary works that are being written in Indian languages, so that they get a chance to get that kind of international exposure. And also, why I mention the cost of a translation, or everything, the quality goes up when you're willing to pay. Because when you're willing to pay, you get good quality translators, you get good quality editors, you get mentors. You can afford to have mentors look at, because it's a very unique craft. Editing a translation is a very unique craft. So when you look, and I'm sure our professors would agree that just knowing a language is not good enough to translate a work. You need a fantastic editorial eyes, an fine editorial mind and mentorship to take a translation, a basic translation, and take it to the next level of excellence. In which, I have been working with organizations like YALI. There's a small, it's a part of a Sangam House International Writers Residency Program, where they try to promote, bring together excellent works in the Indian languages and provide translators with that material and mentorship support to make sure that outstanding works get published in international, So this is some of the work that I do, some of the collaborations that we do. And one thing I just want to mention here is that what I feel is more and more, while we work with multilingual translations and multilingual translators, I've found that increasingly translations or translators between Indian languages have started depending on English as the bridge language. And as a result of which a lot of work is lost, a lot of, the nuances of language, of idiomatic use, local dialect usage, which could have easily and effortlessly translated from one Indian language to another, because it goes via media via the bridge of English, we tend to lose a lot in translation. So these are some of the points that as a person working in this field, I wanted to bring and highlight today.
Okay, so that particular law, especially the last point, we will come to that. We will keep it as a second question. Professor Afsar, initial thought? Professor Afsar, you are teaching South Asian literature, right? Asian literature as such. And you also done that the Festival of Peers. You also have been translating poetry from two languages, Telugu and Hindi, into English. And especially your area of focus in a specific area. So, what do you think? The role of translation in a multilingual society.
Thank you so much, Rajmohan and my good friends here, Neeta ji and Krishna ji, for allowing this discussion. There are actually two aspects that I wanted to bring to the discussion. One is about, as a teacher, how do I feel about the role of translation in a multilingual society, particularly teaching at University of Pennsylvania. I teach courses that are cross-listed with, I teach in South Asia Studies, but my courses are cross-listed with the Department of English and Comparative Literature. So that means translation is a key aspect of our teaching here. And then research-wise too, I focus on translations. But most important task I'm interested is like translations from the original languages like Telugu, Hindi, sometimes Urdu into English. I teach to the students who come from different language and cultural backgrounds. So that is truly a multilingual setting where you come across a lot of languages, not just English, not just like Hindi, Urdu. We also have students from Middle Eastern and other Latin American languages. So it's truly a multilingual setting. So what do they expect when they come to courses that we teach on South Asia? That is the first question we need to address. So of course, most of the students, some of them like scholars, would be scholars in future, like working for MA thesis or like working for their doctoral degree. So when they come to the classroom, they also want to get a sense of how this particular literary text works within the local language culture. For instance, if I'm using Telugu, Hindi, or Urdu text, they also want to understand how that voice of that particular language works. And then they want to get in touch. They want to do a close reading of the translation. So what we're getting here is the close reading that is not based on the original language. It is based on the translated language, that means English, which is obviously a kind of linked language for all these like multilingual group of students. So there actually we need to understand that the translation should be accessible to the students so they could easily read it. They want to look for the flow, natural flow that they feel in their own languages. And then one of the big tasks for a translator is to how to bring that flow, natural flow, into the text. Is it possible at all? I know Krishna ji like have several translations and then research too. and then Neetaji must have published so many translations. But most of I think you look for that natural flow between two languages. If that natural flow is not working, the translation would be a disaster. So one of the tasks for a translator is not to make the task a disaster, but make it a successful translation, right? Particularly like, and then one task, of course, in a original text, sometimes Rajmohanji mentioned about the earliest translations in classical period, such as Ramayana and Mahabharata. I come from a language, Telugu, where the history of literature started with translations itself, right? So Mahabharata is the uh, kind of considered to be the earliest written text in our language. Of course, they never used that term translation in vernacular cultures, because translation is basically a Western concept. It's a product of modernity, basically. But how we need to understand that how Telugu poets, classical Telugu poets, translated this Mahabharata or Ramayana or Bhagavata or other classical Sanskrit texts into Telugu. So what do they mean by translation? So it is not the same process as we know today. Their process was entirely different. You're talking about portability, like allowing just not language, but also the culture to be transported into other language, other culture. So it's a cultural translation, basically. So, but that is like quite interesting and intriguing complication in the translation process. Of course, now we are in times where after globalization and technology and then all this, a lot of like the network sources, a lot of numerous translations are available. But we are not sure which one is really good or better or the best.
Okay.
Of course, recently I've been following this discussion about the great Sufi poet Hafiz into English and various other languages. I just heard that actually they were not translating Hafiz in its true sense. They actually writing their own poetry in the name of Hafiz. So this is also happening in other cultures. So one of the care we need to understand when the role of translator is much larger in this context. Then we can continue the dialogue.
Yeah. Krishna, your initial thought?
Okay, it was just wonderful to listen to Neeta ji and Professor Mohammed, and they come from two very different perspectives. One as a publisher, and then of course a publisher scholar, I may say, and then there is Professor Mohammed, who is an academic, but who is also so alive to all these problems of translation. I think I should begin by saying that I too approach this whole business of translation as basically an academic to start with. I have my recent translation of the Gnanpith Award winner and the stalwart Kannada writer, and I should say perhaps the finest myth maker of this country, Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar, has been published recently. This is a book by Penguin. And working on Dr. Kambar's prose, his poems, and also his plays has always been a very challenging task for me, because he is somebody who draws upon the very rich mythopoeic imagination of the North Karnataka folk community. How do you translate it into English? And what are the challenges of translating the folk idiom, that the very rich folk idiom that Dr. Kambar uses? These are some of the things that I'd like to talk about a little later. But let me start by saying that my initial thoughts about translation have to do so much with my multiple locations. As someone who's been teaching in India at the moment, and as also someone who studied and taught in the US for a very long time, I have always been intrigued by what happens in the academia there. I remember teaching this kind of, it's still very trendy, teaching the global lit courses there. These global literature courses are fascinating, believe me. So in one fell swoop, it's like you gather all these non-European or the so-called post-colonial literatures together here. What do you do there? And what happens to the notion of Indian literature in this whole array of global literatures that we teach or we try to study there is a question that haunted me for a very long time. To begin with, the idea of Indian literature that we are thinking of when we teach or when we study in the US, I started thinking about how do we bring in something that is so rich and so diverse as the concept of Indian literature into this very homogenizing, I'm afraid it is that for the most part, this very homogenizing kind of course that we teach there. So what do we do there? And then there is also this other problem of the post-colonial literature, and I was in that business too, obviously. So there you have this very, very strong focus with Anglophone literatures, of course. And as Neetaji also pointed out, today what finds global visibility as Indian literature is mostly Anglophone writing. Or even if you think of writings in other Indian languages, there is, I'm afraid, already an established canon there. Who are the writers who get translated? Who are the writers who are being projected as Indian writers from these Indian languages? That is a question which has always troubled me and disturbed me a lot. So how is this canon of global literature formed? And what happens to writers who emerge from, say, the locations of marginality? It could be regional, it could be class, it could be caste, it could be gender. There are so many different problems when think of what is defined as Indian literature, very often from outside of India, and what has been projected as such to places outside of India. So this is what made me think more and more about translating from Indian languages. And especially as someone who has grown up with both Kannada and English literary traditions, I have always tried to work with the very rich and diverse writings in Kannada. And I would like to translate them also because it's a part of my mission, because this is where I think we can intervene, interrupt a very homogeneous or a very, very, very unitary kind of an idea of Indian literature that we project outside India. So that was one of the things which made me go to Kannada writing very specifically, and I've been trying to translate from Kannada writing. And as a reader who's been intimate with Dr. Kambar's writing for a very long time, and especially given the kind of challenges you find in his writing, and the manner in which his very specific rootedness in this North Karnataka folk idiom, I'm trying to bring out all these in my translations of Dr. Kambar. So I think we could begin with this, and especially another thing I forgot to mention here is my very long study of South Indian cultural formations. I have been invested in this study. I've been doing this for a very long time, and partly my interest in Kannada writing as such, and also Dr. Kambar's writing springs from my interest in South Indian cultural formations and the literary cultures of South India, especially the Kannada literary tradition.
Okay, thank you. Neeta, you mentioned about carrying Indian literature to global platform. Okay, now I specifically mentioned cultural portability, but two examples are there. One is a very famous example. On the one hand, two extremes. Well, one is a very famous, two famous examples. One is first book in the is 100 Years of Solitude. Okay, the translator took huge amount of liberty. He was not at all, fidelity was not at all observed. He felt that it will sell only if I translate like this. Otherwise, nobody will understand who is Macondo and the culture. Okay, and then on the same spectrum, we have from India, we have example of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Okay, the Ramakrishna Kathamrita, which was translated from Bengali into English, the man took 30 years to translate this. Okay, who takes 30 years? But when it came completely anglicized, but it sold millions of copies. Probably the first Indian book to sell millions and millions of copies and translated to almost all the Indian language, all the foreign languages on par with Bhagavad Gita. Okay, this is what they take. It is not culture, it's not portable. It has to be, translator's role is something else, to add spices to it, to change it, tweak it. On the other hand, the last panel discussion, we had Kalyan Raman, the same translation thing. So he said when he translated Punachi, and the Westland took it even the American market, European market, it sold like hotcakes. Okay, he said, I didn't do anything. I didn't make any effort to do it. If you translate as it is, it means the people will understand. In the Professor Afsar was observing about globalized world. Okay, and then the same period, maybe a couple of years ago, when Peru translated Gachar Gochar into English, it sold well in America also. Okay, it may not have sold up to the expectation in India, but it sold very well in from Kannada into English, where Peru translated it. So how do you think? Where do you fix all these things? When we say that Krishna Manavalli was observing that kind of a rich folk literature of Kambar and others, for example, in Tamil, how do you carry all these people into, like Vijay Dandeta, how do you carry them to global market without, we have to do something to make a specific culture be accessible to, let's say, Bulgarians on the one hand, Spanish world.
So, see, this is, I'm coming back to that point. There are 2 points that I wanted to make here. One was a takeoff from what Professor Krishna just mentioned about who decides, that a work should be translated. Being a publisher, and people like, so what happens is that I feel there's, one, of course, is the fact that, world taking Indian literature to the world. That is one aspect which, like I mentioned, for instance, the responsibility of, say, organizations or, literature academies like the Sahitya Akademi, to be that, when we approach, say, a French organization, or we approach a Norwegian, to understand which are the books we should be translating. They are the ones who make the recommendation. They support those translations to make sure that their books travel beyond their geographies. Similarly, I would feel that in this case, it's not possible for a small publisher. I could publish a very high quality translation, but it's not possible for me to break into markets internationally unless I have the support of some kind of an organization like the Sahitya Akademi, which will do the promotion. For instance, if you go to Frankfurt, the Sahitya Akademi, does the promotions for those translations. It does the, the negotiations into different translations into different languages. That's when in literature, people become aware of the variety and diversity of that literature. So that was one part. The other part which Professor Krishna just mentioned about who chooses the works and how does the work, how do we decide? And earlier, I feel this was something where, senior writers or senior critics or friends of the writers, or, it was a much more closed kind of a circle which would decide which are the books which get published in translation. But I think in that sense, what we have today with us, and especially in the last 15 years, what we have seen is that social media has come in as a disruptor. Because suddenly through Facebook, through Instagram, through Twitter, we are suddenly open and exposed to so much of information regarding what is being written. Earlier, we had more, we would depend on some writer suggesting something, or a writer, a conference, some books coming out of a conference discussion. But now with this, the contemporary writing scene has suddenly been disrupted, and whereas say a unknown writer writing in a language which is not does not have a very big economic market will still be discovered, because somebody might put a post up on Facebook and say that, I just read these poems and they are incredible. And then somebody might just, share something. And that, I feel, in the last few years, that has been the real disruptor in the translation field.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Professor Afsar, that you mentioned that, from that your perspective, that people depending on a link language. Okay. Now, there was a reason why even we were blessed, say 40 till 30 years ago, yeah, almost all the publishers are blessed with translators who are multilingual, actually. We had people who can translate directly from Bengali into Tamil into Bengali. And why we had Odia books in Kannada, or for that matter, Rajasthani, like Marwadi culture and all this, how did it travel to Odia? Marathi into Kashmiri. We had, historically the reasons, migrations, multiple migrations, people came from one region to another, they brought along the language, literature, culture. There are reasons for that. But when we say that it is not possible now to collect people, teach them new language, and then they start translating it directly, it's not possible. Link language is okay, is essential. But as Neeta Gupta was observing, many things get lost when you translate from link through link language. See, that is a problem. But when it comes to, especially you are working in a multiple environment, comparative literature, so don't you think that link language also serves its purpose? Not exactly literary translation as such.
Great question, Rajmohan ji. Before that, I want to bring this aspect of how translations are working right now. So there are actually two types of translations available now, theoretically. One is translations within Indian languages. That is what you are mentioning, from one language, one Indian language to another Indian language. And then there are translations outside India, what we are saying, global visibility, global publications. These are two entirely different processes. So sometimes one translation that works within India might not work outside India.
Yeah.
So there is also one problem I recently hear is that we actually don't get enough translators translating from one Indian language to another Indian language. For instance, Kannada to Telugu, Telugu to Tamil, Tamil to Hindi, this kind of, so that translation process, translators within Indian languages are actually rarely available these days, even though we have numerous publications from Sahitya Akademi and publishers like Afsar. But still it is a big problem, because we are slowly entering into a phase where the knowledge of two languages, bilingualism, is actually coming to an end, let alone multilingualism, right? So in this context, you can't escape a link language. So English is obviously becoming a very dominant language within this translation culture. So everyone, even though you know a person who knows Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, when they want to translate something, they're obviously depending on English translation too. So that is one problem. And then outside India, it's a huge problem. Particularly like what kind of idiom a Western audience likes, or what kind of idiom they are connected to. And then we have these different translations, like in translations into British English, translations into American English. So that's a big issue itself. Linked language is also like not a comfortable, convenient idea. So linked language has its own problems, like English, right? If you do some translation from Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi, Urdu into English, publishers are also looking what kind of English they are using. Either it is British English or American English, right? So there are like so many issues here, but yet we still have to depend on English for so many reasons. And then one reason actually I just like experiencing for like at least the like last 2 decades is like how many people are really concerned about their own language? Are they reading their own texts in their own language? That's also a big question, right? So they are also depending on linked language to read their own texts, right? How many people could read Mahabharata in Telugu, right? It's no way, right? So they actually consult again English translation, right?
Okay.
So this like so many issues there, and I have to obviously like teaching here at like a Western university depend on linked language all the time, even though we try to bring like in comparative literature classes or English literature classes or our own South Asia studies classes too, we actually try to like make students listen to the actual voice of that language. That is only like for a while. Yeah. So, and the rest of the time you do the discussion, you do like everything in linked language, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Professor Krishna, that I know you are talking about translating Kambar's works. If I remember correctly, not Chakori, after that, he wrote one a long time ago, a small piece of, series of folk based on seasons. I think Siegel published it. If I remember correctly, Siegel, somebody translated, and I think Lakshmi or somebody translated and is published by Siegel. So when we are talking about that, when we talk about specifically about translating from Kannada into another language, which Afsar is observing, that on the one hand we have other issues related to that, but technically, theoretically speaking, translating on this, but even there, for leave alone getting global visibility, we have so much of literature. Much of when tribal literature is translated correctly, it sounds beautiful either in Hindi or in Tamil, not in English or Spanish. And how do you think? It is some of the texts are untranslatable, like the Vairamuthu's, the Kallikata Itihas. It got translated beautifully into Hindi, but many of the idioms are missing. Tamil to directly into Hindi, and that somebody he's still struggling. I think it's going to be published, but somebody is still struggling to, because, for example, how do you translate Latvian into English, leave alone the Indian language? So for us, Eskimo people have 7 different words like that in some of the languages like Marwadi and the old Gujarati, which is still there in Mehsana district. Some of the novels there are untranslatable. So how do you think, the translation will come into this place?
And I think at this point we are talking about the actual approaches to translation.
Okay.
And that I think is something which is very, very individuated. After all, translation is also interpretation. I was talking about the politics of language precisely for that reason, because when you translate somebody or when you translate from one language to another, whom do you translate? Who gets translated from one language to another? And how do you translate? These are all questions which are related not only to the specific text that you're translating, but the whole discourse of translation and the politics of translation which surrounds this actual act of translation. That's one thing we have to think of at this point. And now, how do you look at translation? When you think about loss and profit, then it becomes more like a logbook. But on the other hand, if you're thinking about translation as some kind of a transcreation, then I think there is a lot of gain that you see there. On the one hand, the only metaphor that I can think of, because I have been doing music for a very long time, is a musical metaphor. What do you do when you're playing a raga? You first of all, you kind of learn the raga. You have to be a part of the tradition which is familiar with that raga. You practice that raga, and finally you are singing that raga. There is a whole lot of tradition in how you're singing or playing that raga, but at the same time there is something of you in it too, right? Perhaps that's the same thing which is happening with translation, because that is also for me a very creative kind of an endeavor. On the one hand, you have this target language, which has its own culture, which has its own linguistic structures. And on the other hand, you have the source language with its own kind of cultural context. So yeah, naturally, you're translating from one language to another, and you're translating from one culture to another. And what kind of seamlessness can you achieve in this translation is something which you discover only when you are actually into that process of translation. That is one thing. And another thing, as I said, I brought in this metaphor of the raga precisely because this is what I do. When I translate a writer, say when I translate a writer like Kambar, what I do is try to soak into his writings over a period of time so that I get a sense of the sort of idiom that he is using and try to bring that into English without kind of getting into, what I would call Rajaravisms. Because then what are you trying to do there? I don't know if you can actually bring in the Kannada idiom with any sort of fidelity into English. But again, fidelity is a concept that we are moving away from to a large extent now. What I'm trying to do here basically is trying to, with a writer like Kambar, for example, I try to catch the folk rhythms there. I try to bring in the sound elements there. And I try to bring in some of those cultural, very, very specific cultural markers there too. But at the same time, I don't want to go into a very Orientalist mode of trying to say that, oh, here is this very, very, essential, very, very native kind of culture, which I am giving to an audience who are outside of this culture, especially a very, very, non-Indian or like a Western European, Euro-American, Eurocentric audience. Then there is a problem which I see with a lot of translators. They try to have yard-long notes, and then there are copious references. I have a problem with that, obviously, because I think that's a very Orientalist kind of an approach to translating. On the other hand, I do have some endnotes, some references, but at the same time, I also leave it to the reader to make meaning of the text, because I think a reader also participates in making meaning of that text. So this is the way I approach that. Not so much as someone who claims to be very, very, like truthful to the original text, if that in itself is a very problematic concept. And fidelity again becomes another very problematic concept. But I try to achieve that flow, that sort of seamlessness from this language to another, without making it sound like I am trying to bring in the Kannada culture, an alloyed idea of Kannada culture into English.
Okay.
I don't make that claim.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We'll come to that. And then Neetaji, you mentioned global visibility. And also now, recently today, we had another session on the new normal and new literary trends. So what are we going to expect? Like, for example, which will carry translation further? Maybe you mentioned about digital, so probably you can tell something about your into commercial aspect. You can talk about how online books, maybe digital books, electronic books will carry translation better. Yeah.
Yes, so basically, I am talking about a trade-oriented. Of course, these are translations of literary work, but I'm looking at it more as a trade publisher. So I'm just sharing, things like how crucial it is to discover a book. It's wonderful to have that book out, and like Professor Afsar said, more and more people are not reading in their own mother tongue. So that has also been an issue, that because of which we're not getting high quality translations from mother tongue into English or into other languages as well. But what I was talking about, and I sort of mentioned to you earlier in my note, that the crucial aspect of discovering, as a publisher, I need, if I've published a book, I need that the reader must discover that book. So that idea and the crucial aspect of discoverability comes to play, whereas earlier it would be, since the works were more classical or the texts were more, more academic, it would get discovered through the academic route. But since I'm approaching this as a publisher of translations from a trade perspective, what we found is that in the last, and especially in this post-COVID, when the lockdown happened and bookstores were all shut down, we discovered that through the online platforms became very crucial places, and the online communities that developed on various like YouTube or Facebook, where people were discussing translation. And we suddenly realized that there are so many people who are interested. There was this format called Translation Thursdays, which my daughter was running for about 15 weeks. And she would have registrations where she had to close the registrations because beyond a certain number, Zoom does not allow you to. So these are not, just for fun on a platform, on a social media platform. These were serious discussions on translation, where closed groups were discussing issues related to, the technical aspects, the academic aspects of translation. So the communities are massive, and we came to know about this through this, this crucial time of lockdown via, the route of social media.
Okay.
Books were being available. As a publisher, I try to make sure that all my books were available in the ebook or the audiobook format. But the interesting thing we learned, and a lot of, while we can keep on saying that, that translations or, it's not good enough, or whatever it's not enough, the work, that output is not enough. But what we learned is that people are immensely interested in it, and discovering those books through the social media was a very crucial thing in this period.
Okay. So, Professor Afsar, the same question: will the digital electronic books will help academia also?
Yes,
especially
sure.
in translation.
Yeah. Right. Yes, of course. Particularly in the academic area, now we have this new practice of making students available the PDFs and other kind of materials by internet. So most of the libraries, academic libraries, they are providing like digital copies.
Yeah.
Of course, universities actually do that just to make sure that books are available, particularly books from regional languages. This is actually like a new practice that I have been observing for the last 10 years. And then students actually prefer to read them on computer rather than having a physical copy.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. This very interesting to Professor Krishna, that one of the things which is going on, okay, that there is something called TikTok, okay, that gave access to so many rural people, not only in India, all the many countries. Similarly, we have in literary world flash fiction. Okay, you write 500 words, 600 words, you have a flash fiction, the equivalent of TikTok in this literary world. But beyond this, maybe I don't know how, because of this corona, how when this will come, we are going to have visual books. Forget electronic books. Forget this. With augment, when we had a recently, the one tweet went on viral. A teacher in a rural town, in a small town, small Kerala town, she was using augmented reality to teach. You can physically see dinosaurs, everything augmented. Very small town, village, school, they are teaching. So what these people are trying to do is, okay, people reading habits are coming down in any language. People are more interested in visuals. I mean, audiobooks are also not, they're selling that much. Zine is doing well, but others are not. And therefore, we are going to have visual books. Well, in Japan, they did in 2015. I think if I remember correctly, I met Neetaji in Gangtok, and then I also referred to this. So what we are going to, maybe in 5 years' time, maybe 2025, we will have this. Will, I think, such books, will they be a help translator to bring out more to the, reach out to the reader, such untranslatable idioms from the many languages which you have. And subjectivity of the translator also will recede. Is a kind of new medium altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I think that will also bring in a new section of readers or new section of audience to these translations. So I guess there would be very interesting things happening once that really becomes as pervasive as like we think it would be, that would become very soon. But let's wait and see, because I guess it's not only the new readers and new audience that you would be bringing into these like translated these texts, but I think it is also new ways of interpreting these texts and new ways of reviewing these
Exactly.
texts. I think a whole
Exactly.
lot of exciting things can happen.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I mean. We are entirely new medium. So not only the publishers, not the publishers alone have to be one step further. Writers, translators, they also have to be ready. Especially in these times, how the small town writers are coping up with this. And I had a chance to talk to translators from rural small towns in Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. Okay, they say they're struggling. The readers are struggling. So I mean, but they are adapting. They are adapting to online this new medium. And when this comes, this also is going to be anyway. Neeta, all of you, quick word because we have only 5 minutes left. Yeah, yes, Neetaji, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, when you mentioned small towns, so in this last 3.5, 4 months, what we have done as publishers is we've tried to collaborate and bring together small towns. So, a publisher in Sangli or in Dharwad, or we've done these, a kind of a community we've created called the Publishers Exchange, where we get publishers from all Indian languages to come on one platform. And we've created a space online where, say translators or people working in that industry, in the publishing industry, in smaller towns, like say even places like Guwahati or, in Northeast, where they do not have access, or they're, where they have the skills, but they do not have the work. So we're giving them a platform where they can say, I can do this for you. And we find a partner who needs that job to be done. And we are creating these synergies where the work can be, the person who needs the job is able to access the job because there is somebody across in Tamil Nadu or wherever who needs that work to be done.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
These service providers, publishers, translators, we've provided this kind of a platform called the Publishers Exchange, which is providing, and with nothing, it's just an online platform where you can say your skill is this, and they can say, I need this job done, and they can meet and get their work, find a kind of a collaboration opportunity there. So this is something that we've tried in the post-COVID.
Okay. And Professor Afsar, quick word. We have 3 minutes left.
Final words, right?
Yeah.
So basically, at this point, I am focusing more on translation of Sufi poetry from Telugu and Deccani Urdu into English. That is another complication there, particularly when you are translating Sufi poetry that has both Telugu and Urdu elements. So that is a big challenge right now, and I totally believe most of the translators, particularly living in a multilingual setting, they are facing the similar issues.
Yeah.
So that is going to open up a new space for me.
Yeah.
I'm quite excited about it.
Yeah, pandemic is a leveler. It is democratizing. Okay. Professor Manavalli?
Okay, I guess once an academic, you're always that. My problem has to do with the translation review as a genre. There is so much of the publication endeavors happening, and so many translations are getting published, and there is a wide market today for translations. There is a lot of visibility for the translators too. But just look at the review part. I mean, translation review as a whole genre, I think we really need to hone that and think some more about this genre, because sometimes there are marvelous reviews which talk about the translation itself, but sometimes you also see reviews where it's all about the book, the original, and then there is one last line which says so-and-so translated that book. So I'm always, thinking about that part. How do we develop translation review as a genre?
Yeah, at least we have come to, at least we have just evolved to mentioning translator's name on the front wrapper. At least that much is there now. Even if that is not be there, and even the review of translation, I think, except that Chandrachari in Delhi and little bit of biblio, I don't think others are even caring about it. Because when we see Hindi and English literary journals, they are flooded with a lot of original works by big writers and all that. But as you say that the translation review has to be not only here. I mean, recently somebody was reviewing, old book Faulkner. And they are translating some 2 works of Faulkner into Ethiopian, some kind of a language, and then that man is writing in, I think he wrote it in Washington Post. It's about 3,000 words, not a word. At least you're talking about last line, not a single word about translation or translator. Anyway, so this is a fantastic, is a fascinating subject, and we completely run out of time. Thank you, Professor Afsar Ahmed, Professor Krishna Manavalli, Neeta ji. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the viewers from around the world continue to watch a Sahitya Akademi program in all the 24 languages. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.